The Quiet Revolution. The small-town diner, nestled on the corner of Main Street, had a charm that felt timeless. Its neon sign flickered faintly in the early evening light, casting a warm red glow across the windows. Inside, a hum of conversations mixed with the clatter of plates and the sizzle of burgers on the grill. To most, it was an ordinary scene, but for 16-year-old Jake Parker, it was the backdrop to his dreams of a better future. Jake had worked at Millie's Diner for 6 months, bussing tables, washing dishes, and occasionally helping in the kitchen. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep a small savings jar in his room steadily filling with crumpled bills and spare coins. That jar represented his ticket to community college, a stepping stone to something bigger than the sleepy town of Green Valley. Today had been an ordinary shift until he noticed a man struggling near the back booth. The man was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with weathered features that spoke of a hard life. His left leg was a prosthetic, visible beneath the cuff of his jeans, and his right hand trembled as he attempted to cut a piece of chicken fried steak. Jake paused mid-step, his tray of dirty dishes wobbling slightly in his grip. Something about the man's struggle pulled at him. "Hey, Jake, table 3's waiting on water," called Jenna, one of the waitresses, snapping him out of his thoughts. Jake nodded but couldn't shake the image of the man's frustration as he turned toward the kitchen. He dropped off the dishes and grabbed the pitcher of water, but his steps faltered as he passed the man's table again. The steak was still untouched, his fork lying abandoned beside his plate. The man rubbed his temple, looking defeated. Jake hesitated. He knew the rules. Keep your head down. Do your job. Don't get involved. Millie, the diner's owner, had drilled that into every employee during their orientation. "We're here to serve food, not solve problems," she'd said with the kind of finality that discouraged questions. But Jake couldn't ignore the man's struggle. He placed the water pitcher on the counter and approached the booth, his heart pounding. "Excuse me, sir," he said softly. "Would you like some help with that?" The man looked up, his gray eyes sharp but weary. "I'm fine," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with embarrassment. Jake hesitated, unsure if he should push the issue. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, "but it looks like it's giving you a hard time. I can help if you want." The man's gaze softened slightly, and after a moment he nodded. "All right," he muttered, "if you don't mind." Jake slid into the booth across from him, picking up the fork and knife. He carefully cut the steak into bite-sized pieces and placed the utensils back in front of the man. "There you go," he said, offering a small smile. The man nodded his thanks, his hand still trembling as he picked up the fork. "Name's Frank," he said after a few bites, his voice softer now. "Jake," he replied. "Nice to meet you." Frank paused, his fork hovering over his plate. "Not many people would stop to help," he said, his tone unreadable. "Most just stare or look the other way." Jake shrugged. It just felt like the right thing to do. Before Frank could respond, Millie's sharp voice cut through the diner. "Jake, what do you think you're doing?" Jake's stomach dropped as he turned to see Millie marching toward them, her face flushed with anger. "I was just helping," he began, but she cut him off. "We don't have time for this," she snapped. "You've got tables to clear and customers waiting. If you're not going to do your job, you can leave." The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Frank opened his mouth to speak, but Jake shook his head, standing up quickly. "It's fine," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. "I'll just go." As he untied his apron and handed it to Millie, a murmur spread through the diner. Some customers looked away awkwardly, while others exchanged glances filled with sympathy or disapproval. Jake avoided their eyes as he grabbed his backpack and headed for the door. "Wait," Frank called after him, but Jake didn't stop. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped outside, the cool evening air biting against his skin. His hands shook as he walked home, anger and humiliation swirling in his chest. He'd only tried to help, but now he'd lost the job that had been his lifeline. How would he save for college now? The jar on his dresser suddenly seemed more fragile than ever. By the time he reached his family's small apartment, the weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. His mom was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of bills. She looked up when he entered, her brow furrowing. "You're home early," she said. "What happened?" Jake hesitated, then sighed. "I got fired." Her face fell. "What? Why?" "I was helping a customer," he explained, dropping his backpack onto the floor. "He was struggling to eat, so I cut up his food for him." Millie didn't like it. His mom shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and pride. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. "Sometimes standing up for what's right has a cost, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth it." Jake nodded, but her words didn't ease the ache in his chest. He spent the rest of the evening in his room, staring at the jar on his dresser and wondering if he'd ever fill it. The next morning, everything changed. A ripple in the pond. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains in Jake's room, highlighting the worn furniture and stacks of old books on his shelves. He stared at the ceiling, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind like a broken record. Each thought brought a fresh wave of anger and shame. He had tried to do the right thing, and yet it had cost him everything he had worked for. A knock on his bedroom door snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. "Jake, breakfast," his mom called softly. "We need to talk." He sighed, dragging himself out of bed and shuffling to the kitchen. The table was set with scrambled eggs and toast, the smell wafting through the tiny apartment. His mom, dressed in her work scrubs, sat across from him, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Her expression was calm, but Jake could see the concern behind her eyes. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Not much," he admitted, picking at his toast without appetite. She leaned forward. "Listen, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. What you did for that man. Frank, was it? That wasn't just kind, it was brave. But I know you're upset about losing the job." Jake nodded, his throat tightening. "I was so close, Mom. That trip was my chance to stand out, to show the colleges I'm serious about music." "I know, baby," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "But sometimes life throws us curveballs. That doesn't mean we give up." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Jake's mom glanced at him curiously before rising to answer it. Jake followed, standing behind her as she opened the door to reveal an unexpected sight. Frank was there, sitting in his wheelchair, his prosthetic leg hidden beneath neatly pressed jeans. He held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. His eyes softened when they landed on Jake. "Morning," Frank said, his gruff voice carrying a hint of warmth. "I hope I'm not intruding." Jake's mom glanced between them before stepping aside. "Come in, mister." "Frank, just Frank," he said with a nod, rolling himself inside. The narrow apartment hallway seemed even smaller with the large wheelchair. He extended the newspaper toward Jake, who hesitated before taking it. "You're in the paper, kid," Frank said. Jake unfolded the paper, his brow furrowing as he read the headline. "Teen's Act of Kindness Sparks Debate at Local Diner." Beneath it was a grainy photo of Jake cutting Frank's food at the diner. The article described the events that had unfolded, though not entirely accurately. It framed Jake as a compassionate teen who'd been fired for going above and beyond, but it also included a quote from Millie defending her decision. Jake felt his cheeks heat as he skimmed the paragraphs. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered. "I know," Frank said, his tone understanding. "But people are talking about it. Some are angry at Millie, others are calling you a hero." "A hero," Jake scoffed, setting the paper on the table. "I just cut your food. It's not that big of a deal." Frank wheeled closer, his expression serious. "It's not about the food, Jake. It's about what it represented. Most people would have ignored me, written me off as a lost cause. But you didn't. That matters." Before Jake could respond, his mom's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen and raised an eyebrow. "It's the local news station," she said, looking at Jake. "They want to interview you." Jake's heart sank. The last thing he wanted was more attention. "No," he said quickly. "I can't. This is already too much." Frank cleared his throat. "Kid, I get it. You didn't sign up for this. But maybe this isn't just about you anymore." Jake frowned. Confusion etched on his face. "What do you mean?" Frank leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on the wheels. "You've started something, whether you meant to or not. People are paying attention now. You have a chance to use that attention for good." Jake looked to his mom, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Frank's right," she said. "You've already shown people what kindness looks like. Maybe this is your chance to show them more." Reluctantly, Jake agreed to the interview. The news crew arrived that afternoon, their van rumbling into the apartment complex parking lot. Jake's stomach churned as he watched them unload cameras and microphones. His mom stood by his side, her hand on his shoulder. "You'll do great," she said softly. "Just be yourself." The reporter, a young woman with a professional yet approachable demeanor, introduced herself as Lisa. She smiled warmly at Jake as they sat down in the living room, her cameraman adjusting the lighting. "I just want to hear your side of the story," Lisa said, her voice kind. Jake nodded, taking a deep breath. He recounted the events at the diner, emphasizing that he hadn't intended to cause trouble. "I just saw someone who needed help," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't think about it. I just acted." Lisa smiled, her pen scribbling notes. "And how do you feel about the reaction this has sparked?" "The article, the boycott." Jake hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I never wanted any of this to happen," he said. "I don't want people to lose their jobs or for Millie's Diner to go under. I just wanted to do the right thing." The interview wrapped up, and the crew packed their equipment. As they left, Jake felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He had no idea how his words would be received. The next morning, Jake awoke to his phone buzzing incessantly. Texts, calls, and social media notifications flooded his screen. The news story had aired, and it was gaining traction. Strangers from across the country were reaching out, praising his actions, and sharing their own stories of kindness. But not all the messages were positive. Some accused him of seeking attention or trying to make Millie look bad. Jake tried to brush them off, but their words lingered, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. By midday, a new development had emerged. A GoFundMe page had been created in Jake's name, organized by someone in the community. Its goal was to raise enough money to cover the cost of his van trip, and then some. Within hours, donations poured in, accompanied by messages of support. Jake's mom showed him the page, her eyes shining with pride. "Look at this, Jake. People believe in you." Jake stared at the screen, overwhelmed. He didn't know what to say. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "You do," Frank said, wheeling into the room. He'd stayed in touch, becoming a steady presence in Jake's life over the past couple of days. "You've reminded people that small acts of kindness can make a big difference. That's worth celebrating." Jake nodded, a small smile breaking through his uncertainty. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a glimmer of hope. In the days that followed, Jake watched as the ripple he had started grew larger. Local businesses offered to sponsor his band trip, and volunteers organized a community event to celebrate acts of kindness. Frank became an unlikely advocate, sharing his own story and highlighting the importance of compassion. Jake began to realize that his small act at the diner had become something much bigger, a movement that was bringing people together in ways he never could have imagined. And this was just the beginning. A community transformed. The buzz of the past few days felt surreal to Jake. Each morning, he woke up to a flood of messages, news clips, and updates on the GoFundMe page, which had surpassed its initial goal in less than 48 hours. Donations now came with notes from people across the country, sharing stories of how this small act of kindness had inspired them to help others in their own communities. But Jake felt conflicted. While he appreciated the support, he also struggled with the weight of attention. He never intended to be in the spotlight, and he certainly hadn't expected his simple gesture to ripple so far. As he sat at the kitchen table one morning, scrolling through the latest updates on his phone, his mom set a plate of pancakes in front of him. "You've barely touched your breakfast," she said gently, sitting across from him. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Jake sighed, pushing his phone aside. "I don't know, Mom. It's just overwhelming. I didn't do anything special, but now it's like the whole town, and even people outside of it, think I'm some kind of hero." His mom reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over his. "You didn't ask for this, but it happened because you did something that most people wouldn't. You stepped in when others didn't. That's what makes it special." Before Jake could respond, there was a knock at the door. His mom rose to answer it, and moments later, she returned with Frank, who rolled himself into the kitchen with a broad smile. "Morning, kid," Frank said, his voice warm. "How's the newfound fame treating you?" Jake gave a half-hearted chuckle. "Honestly, I wish it would just go away." Frank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that. It's a lot to handle, especially when you didn't ask for it. But sometimes, life puts us in the middle of something bigger than ourselves, whether we're ready for it or not." Jake leaned back in his chair, letting Frank's words sink in. "I just don't know what to do with all of this." Frank wheeled closer, his sharp eyes studying Jake. "I might have an idea," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Remember that cookout we talked about? The Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter is ready to host it, but they want you to be at the center of it. Not as a celebrity, but as someone who represents what this is all about, bringing people together." Jake's mom chimed in, her voice gentle. "This could be a chance to take all that attention and turn it into something good. Show people that kindness isn't just a headline. It's something we can all do." Jake hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it." The cookout. A day of kindness. The day of the cookout arrived with clear blue skies and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of autumn leaves. The local park was transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Volunteers from all corners of Green Valley had come together, setting up tables laden with food, stringing up colorful banners, and arranging folding chairs in a semicircle near the main stage. Jake stood near the entrance with Frank and his mom, watching as families, veterans, and neighbors arrived. There were young children with their faces painted, elderly couples holding hands, and groups of teenagers laughing as they carried trays of hot dogs and hamburgers to the picnic tables. It was a scene Jake had never imagined when he first stepped into the diner that fateful day. Frank nudged him gently. "You okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake chuckled nervously. "I'm just not used to this many people, or this much attention." Frank gave him a reassuring smile. "Just take it one moment at a time. You've got this." As the event kicked off, a local band played upbeat tunes, their lively music drawing smiles, and even a few dancers. Jake walked through the crowd, shaking hands with strangers who approached him to share their gratitude and admiration. A woman with silver hair clasped his hand tightly, her eyes shining with tears. "My grandson is in a wheelchair," she said. "What you did for Frank, it gave me hope. Thank you." Jake's throat tightened, and he could only nod in response. Similar interactions followed, each one leaving him both humbled and overwhelmed. The unexpected speech. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park, it was time for the main event. The organizers had set up a small stage near the center of the park, draped with a banner that read "Kindness in Action, a Community United." Jake's heart pounded as he stood backstage with Frank, waiting for his turn to speak. "I don't think I can do this," he muttered, tugging at the collar of his shirt. "You can," Frank said firmly. "Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone wants to hear." When Jake's name was called, a round of applause erupted from the crowd. He stepped onto the stage, squinting against the bright stage lights. The sea of faces before him blurred together, and for a moment he felt like bolting. But then he spotted his mom, standing near the front, her smile steady and encouraging. Frank was beside her, giving him a thumbs up. Jake took a deep breath and gripped the microphone. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice trembling slightly. I don't really know what to say. I'm just a kid who works, or used to work, at a diner." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, easing his nerves slightly. "I didn't do anything special," he continued. "I just saw someone who needed help, and I did what felt right. I didn't think it would lead to all of this." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that small actions can make a big difference. We don't have to do something huge or extraordinary to make the world a little better. Sometimes it's as simple as showing kindness to someone who needs it." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Jake felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. As he stepped off the stage, Frank was waiting, his eyes glistening with emotion. "You did good, kid," he said, clapping Jake on the back. The beginning of something bigger. The cookout ended with a sense of unity and purpose that lingered long after the last table was cleared. Jake's act of kindness had sparked something much larger than he could have imagined, a movement that extended beyond Green Valley. Local businesses pledged to sponsor similar events, and the town began organizing monthly kindness days where people could come together to volunteer, donate, and connect. As Jake walked home that evening with his mom and Frank, the stars twinkling above them, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in days. His mom squeezed his shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. Frank chuckled. "Told you this would be bigger than you, kid." Jake smiled, his heart full. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. The fire that ignited a movement. Jake woke the morning after the cookout to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on his nightstand. At first, he groaned and pulled the covers over his head, hoping the world might give him a few more minutes of peace. But the buzzing persisted, and he reluctantly reached for the phone. What he saw made him sit upright. His inbox was flooded with emails, text messages, and notifications. Posts about the cookout had gone viral overnight. Videos of his speech, snippets of conversations with Frank, and snapshots of the community coming together were being shared across social media. Hashtags like #KindnessInAction and #OnActMatters were trending. Jake's mom knocked softly on his door and peeked inside, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You're famous again," she said, holding out her phone, which displayed a news clip about the event. "They're calling you the boy who brought a town together." Jake ran a hand through his hair, still trying to process the sudden whirlwind of attention. "I didn't do anything that special," he mumbled. His mom crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed. "Maybe not to you, but to a lot of people, what you did was a reminder that the world isn't as divided as it seems. You gave them hope, Jake." He sighed, leaning back against the headboard. "It's just a lot. I don't know how to handle all of this." "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "Frank and I are here, and so is the community. You've started something big, and people want to help." The call that changed everything. Later that afternoon, while Jake was practicing his trumpet in the small living room, his phone rang again. He considered ignoring it, but decided to check the caller ID. The number wasn't familiar, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Is this Jake Parker?" A warm, professional voice on the other end asked. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Rachel Evans," the woman replied. "I'm with the National Kindness Foundation. We've been following your story and the impact it's had on your community. I'd love to talk to you about how we can support your efforts and take this movement to a national level." Jake's jaw dropped. "A national level?" "Yes," Rachel said enthusiastically. "What you've done in Green Valley is incredible, and it's sparked a lot of interest. We think this could be the beginning of something much bigger." Jake was at a loss for words. He glanced at his mom, who had been listening from the kitchen. She gave him an encouraging nod. I don't know," he stammered. "I'm just a kid." "That's exactly why it's so inspiring," Rachel said. "If you're open to it, we'd love to help you organize similar events in other towns. We can provide resources, connect you with local leaders, and even fundraise to support your vision." Jake hesitated. The idea of expanding the movement was exciting, but it also felt overwhelming. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Rachel said. "Take your time. We'll be here when you're ready." After the call ended, Jake sat in silence, staring at his phone. His mom walked over and sat beside him. "That's a big opportunity," she said. "I know," Jake said, still processing. "But what if I mess it up? What if I'm not cut out for this?" His mom smiled gently. "You've already proven you are. You didn't plan any of this, but you stepped up when it mattered. That's all you need to do. Keep stepping up." Green Valley's transformation. Over the next few weeks, Green Valley underwent a remarkable transformation. Inspired by Jake's actions and the cookout's success, local leaders began implementing new initiatives to foster community connections. The library hosted a weekly kindness hour where people could gather to write letters to veterans, assemble care packages for the homeless, or simply share stories of kindness. Local businesses got involved too. The hardware store offered discounts to customers who donated supplies for community projects, and the bakery introduced a pay-it-forward program, encouraging patrons to buy an extra loaf of bread or pastry for someone in need. Jake, meanwhile, found himself at the center of it all. Though he was initially hesitant to embrace his newfound role, Frank's steady encouragement and his mom's unwavering support helped him navigate the challenges. Together, they brainstormed ways to keep the momentum going without losing sight of the movement's core message, that small acts of kindness could create big changes. One day, Frank invited Jake to the local veterans center, where a group of retired servicemen and women had gathered to thank him. Jake felt out of place at first, but as the veterans shared their stories, he realized how much his actions had meant to them. Many spoke of feeling invisible or forgotten, much like Frank had described. "You reminded us that we still matter," one veteran said, his voice thick with emotion. "That people still care." Jake left the center that day with a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one act of kindness or one cookout. It was about changing the way people saw each other, about reminding them of their shared humanity. The national stage. When Rachel Evans from the National Kindness Foundation called again, Jake was ready. With Frank and his mom by his side, he agreed to partner with the organization to expand the movement. Over the next few months, they worked tirelessly to plan a series of events in towns across the country. The first stop was a neighboring city, where Jake gave a speech at a high school assembly. The students listened intently as he shared his story, and by the end of the day, they had organized their own kindness club to continue the work locally. From there, the movement snowballed. Communities across the country hosted cookouts, organized donation drives, and launched initiatives to support their neighbors. Jake traveled to several of these events, often accompanied by Frank, who had become a powerful advocate for veterans' rights and accessibility. Back in Green Valley, the changes were even more profound. The diner where it all began struggled initially due to the boycott, but after Jake publicly spoke out in support of the staff, business gradually recovered. Millie, humbled by the experience, even apologized to Jake and began donating a portion of the diner's profits to local charities. A new vision. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch with Frank, watching the sunset over the town, he reflected on how far they'd come. "It's crazy to think all of this started because of a piece of chicken fried steak," he said with a laugh. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "It started because you saw someone who needed help and didn't look the other way. That's all it takes, a moment of courage and compassion." Jake nodded, his heart full. He still didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but for the first time, He felt ready to embrace it. The jar on his dresser was no longer just a symbol of his college dreams. It was a reminder of the ripple effect of kindness and the power of community. And this was only the beginning. The ripple becomes a wave. Months passed, and Jake's life continued to change in ways he could never have imagined. The movement he had sparked in Green Valley had grown into a nationwide campaign, powered by stories of everyday kindness and supported by the National Kindness Foundation. Everywhere Jake went, he was met with people eager to share how the movement had inspired them to make a difference in their own communities. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Jake tried to keep his feet on the ground. He still practiced his trumpet every evening, finding solace in the familiar notes and rhythms. His band trip fund, once a source of anxiety, had been fully covered by the GoFundMe donations. The leftover funds had been redirected to start a scholarship program for other students in need, an idea Jake had insisted on. But with the good came challenges. Not everyone was supportive of the movement. Online, Jake occasionally stumbled across comments accusing him of being a media puppet or questioning his motives. Even in Green Valley, a few residents grumbled about the changes, claiming the focus on kindness was just a fad that wouldn't last. One such critic was Millie, the owner of the diner where Jake's journey had begun. Though she had publicly apologized for firing him, she still seemed wary of the attention her business had received. "You can't build a life on feel-good stories," she'd muttered during an interview with the local paper. "People need to focus on hard work, not handouts." Jake struggled with how to respond. Part of him wanted to ignore the negativity, but another part felt a responsibility to address it. After all, wasn't the whole point of the movement to bring people together? The conference call. One crisp Saturday morning, as Jake sat at the kitchen table with his mom and Frank, Rachel Evans called to discuss the next phase of the campaign. This time, her proposal was bigger than anything they'd attempted before. "We've been invited to speak at the National Civic Leadership Conference," she said, her excitement evident even over the phone. "It's a huge platform, Jake. Leaders from across the country will be there. Politicians, activists, educators. This is our chance to take the movement to the next level." Jake's stomach flipped. The thought of speaking in front of such an influential audience was terrifying. "I don't know, Rachel," he said hesitantly. "What could I possibly say to people like that? I'm just a kid." "You're more than that, Jake," Rachel replied firmly. "You've inspired thousands of people with your actions and your story. That's why they want to hear from you, because you're proof that one person can make a difference." Frank, who had been listening quietly, nodded in agreement. "She's right, kid. You've got something most of those folks don't. A real, honest connection to people. Just speak from the heart." Jake glanced at his mom, who gave him an encouraging smile. "You've got this," she said softly. After a long pause, Jake exhaled deeply. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." Preparing for the stage. In the weeks leading up to the conference, Jake worked closely with Rachel and Frank to prepare his speech. They spent hours in the library, researching the history of civic movements and studying examples of leaders who had used their platforms to create meaningful change. Jake wanted to ensure his message was both heartfelt and impactful. "I don't want this to be about me," he told Rachel during one brainstorming session. "It's about everyone, about what we can all do to make the world better." "That's exactly what you should focus on," Rachel said, jotting down notes. "Your story is just the starting point. The real power comes from showing people how they can be part of the change." Frank helped Jake refine his delivery, using his own experience as a public speaker to guide him. "Pause when you need to," he advised. "Let the words sink in, and don't be afraid to share your emotions. They're what connect you to your audience." Jake practiced tirelessly, often staying up late to rehearse in front of the mirror. His mom, ever supportive, would sit in the living room with a mug of tea, listening to his speeches and offering gentle feedback. "You're going to be amazing," she said one night, her voice filled with pride. "No matter what happens, just remember why you're doing this." The conference. The National Civic Leadership Conference was held in a grand convention center in the heart of the city. Jake felt a mix of awe and nervousness as he stepped inside, surrounded by towering glass walls and gleaming marble floors. Delegates from across the country bustled through the hallways, their name tags and lanyards identifying them as mayors, nonprofit directors, and community leaders. Jake's session was scheduled for the afternoon, but the hours leading up to it felt endless. He sat in a quiet backstage area with Frank and Rachel, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed his notes one last time. "You're going to do great," Rachel said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Just remember, this isn't about impressing anyone. It's about sharing your truth." Finally, the moment arrived. Jake's name was announced, and he stepped onto the stage, blinking against the bright lights. The auditorium was massive, filled with hundreds of faces that blurred together in his peripheral vision. He took a deep breath, gripping the microphone tightly. "Hi, I'm Jake Parker," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "A few months ago, I was just a kid working at a diner in a small town. I didn't think much about how my actions could affect the world around me. But then, something happened that changed everything." As Jake shared his story, the room grew silent, the audience hanging on his every word. He spoke about Frank, the cookout, and the ripple effect of kindness. He talked about the challenges and criticisms he had faced, but also about the overwhelming support and hope he had witnessed. "I'm not here to tell you how to change the world," he concluded. "I'm here to remind you that it starts with small, simple actions. A smile, a helping hand, a moment of compassion. These are the things that bring us together. And when we come together, there's nothing we can't accomplish." The applause that followed was deafening. Jake's chest swelled with a mix of relief and pride as he stepped off the stage, where Frank was waiting with a grin. "You nailed it, kid," he said, clapping Jake on the back. The beginning of a new chapter, the conference marked a turning point for Jake and the movement he had inspired. In the weeks that followed, donations to the National Kindness Foundation surged, and communities across the country launched new initiatives to promote compassion and unity. Jake became a sought-after speaker, traveling to schools, events, and organizations to share his message. Back in Green Valley, the town continued to thrive. The monthly Kindness Days became a beloved tradition, and the diner, once the center of controversy, transformed into a hub for community gatherings. Even Millie began to soften, volunteering her time to help organize events and offering free meals to those in need. For Jake, life was busier than ever, but he never lost sight of what mattered most. Each night, he returned to his small room, where his trumpet and the jar on his dresser served as reminders of how far he had come and how far he still had to go. One evening, as he played a soft melody, Frank's words echoed in his mind. "It started because you saw someone who needed help and didn't look the other way." Jake smiled, knowing that no matter where this journey took him, he would always hold on to that simple truth. And with that, the ripple he had created continued to grow, spreading hope and kindness to every shore it touched. Legacy of kindness. As Jake's movement gained momentum, it began to evolve into something larger than he could have ever imagined. What started as a small-town story had grown into a national call to action. The National Kindness Foundation's network expanded, creating a platform for stories of compassion and programs aimed at fostering kindness in schools, businesses, and neighborhoods. And through it all, Jake remained its most relatable and humble face. But with growth came responsibility and challenges. The newfound visibility meant constant demands on Jake's time. Every week brought more requests for interviews, speeches, and public appearances. While he loved seeing the positive impact, the pressure often felt overwhelming. One night, after returning home from a whirlwind trip to a neighboring state, Jake slumped onto the couch, exhaustion etched across his face. His mom handed him a steaming mug of tea and sat beside him, her warm presence a steadying force. "You've been running nonstop, baby," she said gently. "When's the last time you just rested. Jake sighed, staring into the swirling steam of his tea. I don't even remember. It feels like if I stop, everything will fall apart. His mom placed a comforting hand on his knee. You're doing incredible things, Jake, but you're only human. Even heroes need a break. The weight of her words sank in, and Jake realized how much he had been pushing himself. He decided to take a step back, delegating more responsibilities to Rachel and the Foundation's team, while he focused on finishing high school and reconnecting with the life he had left behind in Green Valley. A return to roots. Jake's decision to slow down coincided with an unexpected email from Mr. Anderson, his old band teacher. The subject line read, "We need you." Curious, Jake opened it and read about the upcoming regional band competition. His old school was participating, but they were struggling to motivate the students. They need inspiration. Jake, Mr. Anderson wrote, "You're the perfect person to remind them of what's possible." The message brought back a flood of memories. His first trumpet lesson, the camaraderie of the band room, the dream of performing at the Chicago Festival. Though his life had taken a different path, music had always been his sanctuary. Jake replied immediately, "Count me in." Reigniting the spark. When Jake arrived at the school a week later, he was greeted with a mix of awe and excitement. The band students, many of whom had followed his journey online, treated him like a celebrity. But Jake quickly put them at ease with his down-to-earth demeanor. He spent the day rehearsing with them, sharing tips and encouraging them to play with heart. "Music isn't just about hitting the right notes," he said during a break. "It's about telling a story, connecting with your audience. When you play with passion, people feel it." The students responded with renewed energy, their performances improving with each session. Jake also shared stories from his journey, emphasizing the importance of teamwork and perseverance. By the end of the day, the band room buzzed with excitement and determination. Before leaving, Jake pulled Mr. Anderson aside. "Thank you for reaching out," he said. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." Mr. Anderson smiled. "You've been giving so much to the world, Jake. I'm glad you found your way back to something that gives to you." The Gala of Gratitude. A few weeks later, Jake received an invitation to a Gala of Gratitude, an event organized by the National Kindness Foundation to celebrate the movement's impact. Held in a grand ballroom in the heart of the city, the gala would bring together supporters, volunteers, and beneficiaries from across the country. Jake hesitated at first, worried it might feel too self-congratulatory. But Rachel convinced him otherwise. "This isn't about you," she said. "It's about everyone who's been part of this journey. It's a chance to thank them and inspire even more people." The night of the gala arrived, and Jake found himself standing on a stage once again, this time in front of an audience that included business leaders, educators, and activists. The room shimmered with elegant decorations and warm lighting, but what struck Jake most was the genuine camaraderie among the attendees. He took the microphone, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "When this all started, I was just a kid bussing tables at a diner," he began. "I never imagined that a single act of kindness could lead to something like this. But what I've learned is that kindness isn't just a moment, it's a movement. And every one of you in this room is proof of that." As Jake spoke, he saw familiar faces in the crowd. Frank, sitting proudly in the front row. His mom, beaming with pride. And even Millie, who had recently joined the movement after seeing its transformative impact on the community. Their presence reminded him of how far they had come, and how much further they could go. The next chapter. The gala marked the beginning of a new phase for the movement. Inspired by the event, businesses pledged funding for kindness initiatives, schools committed to incorporating empathy into their curriculums, and volunteers signed up to expand the program into underserved communities. Jake, now a senior in high school, continued to balance his role as the face of the movement with his personal goals. With his band trip funds secured, he finally had the opportunity to perform at the regional competition, which felt like a homecoming. The band's performance was electrifying, earning them a standing ovation and a spot in the finals. Backstage, Mr. Anderson pulled Jake aside, his eyes glistening with pride. "This is just the beginning for you," he said. "You have a gift, Jake, not just for music, but for inspiring people. Never lose that." Building a legacy. By the time Jake graduated, the movement he had sparked was thriving independently. The foundation had established partnerships with hundreds of communities, creating a network of kindness ambassadors who carried the message forward. Jake remained involved, but he was no longer the sole driver of its success, a fact that brought him immense relief and pride. One summer evening, as Jake sat on the porch with Frank, they reflected on how much had changed since the day they met at the diner. "You know," Frank said, his voice filled with warmth, "I used to think my best days were behind me, but meeting you proved me wrong. You gave me purpose again, kid." Jake smiled, his eyes shining. "You gave me purpose too, Frank. I wouldn't be here without you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a golden glow, Jake felt a profound sense of peace. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he was ready to face it, with kindness at the center of everything he did. Because in the end, Jake had learned that the smallest acts of compassion could create waves of change, rippling outward to touch countless lives, and he was determined to keep that legacy alive. The movement that never ends. As summer turned to fall, the movement Jake had sparked continued to thrive. Green Valley became a model town for community engagement, its transformation a testament to the power of compassion. Visitors from across the country came to learn how a single act of kindness had sparked a revolution of goodwill. The diner, once a place of controversy, now hosted weekly kindness nights, where people shared meals and stories that inspired others to give back. Jake's life, too, had entered a new chapter. Having graduated high school with a scholarship from the Kindness Fund he had helped establish, he prepared to attend college in a neighboring city. While he looked forward to pursuing his passion for music, a part of him worried about leaving the movement behind. On his last night in Green Valley, a small gathering was held at the park, the same one where the first community cookout had taken place. The town had come together once more, this time to say goodbye to the boy who had reminded them of their shared humanity. As the sun set, casting the park in warm hues of orange and gold, Jake stood before the crowd. The familiar faces of his neighbors, friends, and family looked back at him, their smiles filled with pride and gratitude. "I've been thinking a lot about what this journey has meant," Jake began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "When it all started, I thought I was just helping one person. I didn't realize how much that moment would change my life. And all of ours." He paused, scanning the crowd. Frank sat in the front row, his military cap tilted slightly, his expression a mix of pride and affection. Jake's mom stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she blinked back tears. "But the truth is," Jake continued, "this movement isn't about me. It's about us, about what we can accomplish when we choose kindness over division, action over apathy. I may be leaving Green Valley, but this isn't goodbye. The movement is bigger than any one person, and I know you'll all continue to carry it forward." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Jake felt a surge of emotion as he stepped down from the makeshift stage. People rushed forward to hug him, shake his hand, and offer their well wishes. Frank wheeled over to him, his weathered face breaking into a wide grin. "You've done good, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever forget where you came from, or what you've started." Jake knelt beside Frank, his eyes glistening. "I won't, Frank. I promise." A new beginning. College brought new challenges and opportunities for Jake. He joined the university's jazz ensemble, finding solace and inspiration in music as he navigated the demands of academic life. But he never forgot the movement that had shaped him. Between classes and rehearsals, he stayed in touch with Rachel and the National Kindness Foundation, offering input and occasionally attending events to keep the momentum alive. Meanwhile, Green Valley thrived in Jake's absence. The town's monthly kindness days became a permanent tradition, and the scholarship fund Jake had started expanded to support students in neighboring communities. Frank took on a more active role, becoming a mentor to young volunteers and sharing his story with anyone who would listen. Jake's story also continued to inspire others. Schools across the country adopted kindness curriculums, teaching students the value of empathy and community service. Businesses launched campaigns to promote workplace compassion, and social media platforms saw a rise in positive, uplifting content. A legacy of compassion. Years later, Jake returned to Green Valley for the dedication of a new community center. The building, funded by donations from the kindness movement, was designed to serve as a hub for outreach programs, workshops, and events. Its name, the Parker Center for Compassion and Connection. Standing before the crowd, Jake felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. His mom stood beside him, her hair now streaked with silver, but her smile just as warm. Frank, though older and slower, still exuded the same quiet strength that had inspired Jake so many years ago. "This center isn't just a building," Jake said during the dedication speech. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. It's proof that kindness isn't just a fleeting moment. It's a way of life." As he cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted into cheers, and Jake felt the weight of his journey come full circle. He had once feared that leaving Green Valley would mean leaving the movement behind, but now he saw that it had never been about him. The ripple he had started had grown into a wave, carried forward by countless others who believed in the power of compassion. The final note. That evening, as Jake stood on the porch of his childhood home, he reflected on everything that had brought him to this moment. The diner, the cookout, the speeches, and the setbacks. All of it had been part of a larger story. A story of resilience, community, and the quiet strength of one small act of kindness. Picking up his trumpet, Jake played a soft, soulful melody that carried through the still night air. It was a song of gratitude, of hope, and of new beginnings, a reminder that no matter how far he went, the values he had learned in Green Valley would always be with him. As the final notes faded, Jake smiled, knowing that the movement would continue to grow, touching lives in ways he could never predict. And in his heart, he knew that the legacy of kindness would never end.